-54 degrees Celsius transforms the Siberian air from a breathable gas into something resembling shattered glass, invading the lungs. At that temperature, the Siberian air stops being a gas and feels more like shattered glass entering your lungs. Sarah Jenkins, a senior wildlife biologist from Montana, stared through the frost-choked glass into the endless, suffocating darkness of the taiga. She was stationed 300 miles from the nearest paved road, managing an isolated research outpost dedicated to tracking the dwindling populations of apex predators. She was alone. Her research partner, David, had packed his bags 2 months prior, broken by the perpetual twilight and the bone-deep isolation. He had begged her to leave with him on the last supply helicopter, warning her that the forest would eventually swallow her whole. Sarah had refused. The wilderness made sense to her in a way that people never did. The wind howled, a guttural shriek that rattled the thick timber walls of the cabin. But beneath the roar of the gale, Sarah heard something else. It was faint, ragged, and undeniably desperate. A high-pitched mewl. She strapped on her heavy parka, grabbed her high-powered flashlight, and pushed her weight against the frozen front door. The cold hit her like a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture in her nostrils. She waded into the waist-deep snow, following the faint sound. 50 yards from her porch, the beam of her flashlight caught a splash of horrifying crimson against the pristine white. It was the mutilated carcass of an adult female Siberian tiger. The animal had been professionally skinned, its magnificent pelt stripped away by poachers who had left the meat to rot. Beside the bloody remains of its mother lay a cub. It couldn't have been more than 3 months old. It was violently shivering, its fur matted with ice and its mother's blood. The cub's left ear was severely frostbitten, blackened at the tip. It was dying. Sarah didn't think about protocol. She didn't think about the strict international regulations regarding the handling of endangered species. She scooped the limp, freezing mass of fur into her arms, tucked it inside her parka against her own body heat, and fought the blizzard back to the cabin. The next 48 hours were a blur of desperation. Sarah converted her tiny bathroom into an intensive care unit. She used her own heating pads, wrapped the cub in her thickest wool blankets, and carefully fed it a mixture of condensed milk and raw egg yolks through a large syringe. On the 3rd day, the cub opened its eyes a striking, piercing amber and let out a weak hiss. Sarah exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for days. She named him Orion. Keeping a Siberian tiger cub in a research cabin was highly illegal and incredibly dangerous. But Orion was too weak to survive a transport, and the local wildlife authorities were notoriously underfunded and corrupt. If she surrendered him, he would likely end up in a concrete cell in a black market roadside zoo, or worse, sold for parts. For 6 months, Orion lived in the cabin. He grew with terrifying speed, transforming from a fragile, stumbling furball into a 100-pound adolescent predator. Despite his size, he was endlessly affectionate with Sarah. He would follow her around the small space, destroying her boots, chewing on her telemetry equipment, and sleeping across the foot of her bed. His massive purr vibrating through the floorboards. Due to the severe frostbite he suffered on that first night, the blackened tip of his left ear eventually fell off, leaving him with a distinct, jagged notch. It was a permanent scar of his traumatic beginning. Sarah knew she couldn't keep him forever. Her plan was to slowly rewild him, teaching him to hunt in the fenced perimeter behind the station, preparing him for a quiet release in the spring. But she had made a fatal miscalculation. She had trusted the wrong person. Thomas was the regional logistics manager who brought Sarah her supplies every quarter via snowmobile. He was a gruff, seemingly jovial man from Chicago who had spent a decade in the Russian wilderness. During a routine drop-off in late November, Thomas arrived unannounced, 2 days early. When he pushed open the cabin door, he froze. Orion, now the size of a large dog, was gnawing on a deer femur in the center of the rug. The tiger immediately stood, lowering his head and issuing a low, rumbling growl at the intruder. "Sarah," Thomas whispered, his hand inching toward the hunting knife on his belt. "What the hell is that?" Sarah quickly stepped between them, her heart hammering. She begged Thomas to keep the secret. She explained the poaching, the frozen cub, and her plan to release him in the spring. Thomas listened, his face unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, Sarah. I won't say a word, but you need to get him out of here soon. If the authorities find out, you'll be deported and he'll be put down." Sarah thanked him, believing she had secured an ally. 3 days later, she woke to the sound of heavy diesel engines. She looked out the window to see a military-grade transport truck and 3 armed men stepping out. Leading them was Thomas. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Thomas said as the armed men pushed past her into the cabin, holding tranquilizer rifles. "But there's a massive bounty on these cats. The state zoo is paying a fortune for a live adolescent. I couldn't pass it up." Sarah fought. She screamed. She struck one of the men, but she was easily overpowered and restrained. She was forced to watch as they shot Orion with a dart. The tiger fought the drugs, roaring and thrashing. His amber eyes locked onto Sarah in confusion and panic until his legs finally gave out. They dragged him into a heavy steel transport cage in the back of the truck. "You're a monster, Thomas," Sarah screamed, tears freezing on her cheeks as the truck's engine roared to life. "I'm a businessman," he replied coldly, tossing her a warning look. "Pack your bags. You're fired. You have a week to vacate the cabin before the new researcher arrives." Sarah sat in the snow for hours after they left, the silence of the taiga pressing down on her, crushing her. Sarah didn't leave. She barricaded herself in the cabin, ignoring the radio calls from the regional office. She spent her days aggressively tracking the poachers in the area, driven by a dark, consuming rage. A week after Orion was taken, the regional radio frequency crackled to life with an emergency broadcast. A massive winter storm had triggered a localized avalanche on the mountain pass leading back to the city. Sarah listened, her blood turning to ice, as the dispatcher reported that a wildlife transport truck had been caught in the slide. It had plummeted into a deep, inaccessible ravine. Search and rescue teams couldn't reach it due to the weather, but thermal imaging from a helicopter confirmed there were no human survivors in the cab. As for the cargo in the back, the heavy steel cage had been torn open by the impact. The thermal imaging showed nothing. Orion was gone. The authorities presumed the tiger had perished in the crash or frozen to death in the aftermath, severely drugged and lacking survival skills. Sarah mourned him all over again. She felt the heavy, crushing guilt of his loss. If she had left him in the snow, he would have died quickly. Instead, she had given him a taste of warmth and love, only to deliver him into a nightmare. 5 years passed. The research program had abandoned the outpost, cutting its funding entirely. Sarah had stayed anyway, buying the cabin for a fraction of its cost and living entirely off the grid. She became a ghost of the taiga, a solitary figure who mapped poacher routes and anonymously reported them to international wildlife watchdogs. She had dismantled a dozen illegal logging camps and destroyed countless snare lines. She was feared by the local criminal element, known only as the Ice Witch among the trappers. Her most dangerous adversary was Aiden, a ruthless, heavily armed poacher from Detroit who had fled to Siberia to avoid federal charges in the States. Aiden ran a highly organized, illegal hunting syndicate. Over the years, Sarah had cost him millions in seized pelts and destroyed equipment. He had put a bounty on her head. It was late December when Sarah made a critical error. She had been tracking a newly laid snare line deep into a dense, unfamiliar section of the pine forest. She was tired, her focus slipping. She heard the mechanical snap a second before she felt the agonizing, searing pain in her right leg. Sarah collapsed onto the snow, screaming. A heavy bear trap, illegally modified with jagged teeth, had crushed her calf. Blood instantly began to soak through her thermal pants, staining the snow around her. Panic set in. She fumbled for her radio, but in her fall, it had smashed against a rock. She was miles from her cabin. The temperature was dropping, rapidly approaching -40. Then, she heard the crunch of heavy boots on the snow. From behind the tree line stepped Aiden. He was flanked by 2 other men, all carrying heavy hunting rifles. Aiden grinned, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Well, Aiden chuckled, racking the bolt of his rifle. Look what the trap caught. The bleeding heart herself. Sarah dragged herself backward, the trap chains clanking heavily against the frozen earth. The pain was blinding. Aiden, she gasped. "If you kill me, my beacon. Your beacon is broken, sweetheart." Aiden interrupted, kicking the shattered pieces of her radio. "And out here? People disappear all the time. The wolves will scatter your bones before the spring thaw." He raised his rifle, aiming it directly at her chest. "Nothing personal, Sarah. You just cost me too much money." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. She thought of the cold. She thought of David, who had left her. She thought of Thomas, who had betrayed her. And, in her final moments, she thought of the warm, rumbling purr of a fragile cub with a frozen ear. A sound shattered the silence. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a roar. It was a sound so deep and resonant that Sarah felt it vibrate in her chest cavity. It was the primal, terrifying sound of an apex predator challenging its prey. Aiden spun around, his eyes widening in horror. From the dense shadows of the pines emerged a nightmare of muscle, fur, and suppressed violence. It was a fully grown male Siberian tiger, easily weighing over 600 pounds. Its coat was a vibrant, fiery orange cut with thick, jet-black stripes, contrasting violently with the white snow. It didn't hesitate. The tiger lunged with explosive speed. Aiden barely had time to scream before 500 pounds of muscle slammed into him, knocking the rifle from his hands. The two other poachers panicked. One fired a wild shot into the trees and ran. The other dropped his weapon and scrambled desperately up a nearby pine tree. The tiger ignored the fleeing men. It stood over Aiden, pinning him to the snow. The beast let out another deafening roar directly into Aiden's face, a sound that promised absolute destruction. Aiden lay entirely still, whimpering, too terrified to even breathe. The tiger stared down at the poacher for a long, agonizing moment. Then, slowly, it lifted its massive head and turned its gaze toward Sarah. Sarah's breath hitched. She lay frozen in the snow, the pain in her leg momentarily forgotten. She stared at the massive predator, waiting for it to strike her next. The tiger took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Its amber eyes locked onto hers. It lowered its massive, heavy head, stepping over the chain of the bear trap. It leaned in, its hot, damp breath washing over Sarah's freezing face. She braced for the end. Instead, the tiger gently nudged its wet nose against her cheek. It was a soft, deliberate bump. Then, it exhaled a low, vibrating rumble, a purr. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. She reached a trembling hand up toward the animal's massive head. As her fingers brushed against its thick fur, her eyes traced the lines of its skull up to its left ear. The tip of the ear was missing, marked by a deep, jagged notch. "Orion," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking, tears instantly freezing as they fell. The massive tiger chuffed a soft greeting sound. It pressed its forehead against hers for one fleeting, beautiful second. It remembered, across 5 years of brutal wilderness, across the trauma of captivity and a violent crash, the apex predator remembered the woman who had traded her warmth for his life. Orion pulled back. He looked at the trembling Aiden on the ground, issued one final, low growl that sent the man scrambling backward in terror, and then turned. Without another sound, the ghost of the taiga melted back into the dark shadows of the trees, disappearing as quickly as he had arrived. Aiden and his men, terrified out of their minds, didn't attempt to finish the job. In fact, Aiden helped pry the trap off Sarah's leg, purely out of fear that the monster in the woods would return if he didn't. He carried her back to the main trail before fleeing the territory entirely, never to be seen in that part of Siberia again. Sarah survived. It took months of physical therapy, and she walked with a permanent limp, but she returned to her cabin. She never saw Orion again. She didn't try to track him. He belonged to the wild now, the undisputed king of the taiga. But sometimes, on the darkest, coldest nights, when the temperature dropped to 50 below and the wind shrieked against the timber walls, Sarah would look out her frosted window, and out there, just beyond the tree line, she would catch the briefest flash of amber eyes in the dark, watching over her.